I couldn't help but notice that the last few episodes had a philosophical bent to them. Thoughts about my life and what I wanted to do with it, along with influences and feelings that I got externally. So I thought I'd go back to a more technical episode and go into great detail about different IBM PCs and compatibles that I have owned, and how my life had changed with each of them. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, a podcast about technology, history, and getting myself out of debt. Thanks to Daniel Boyd, Eric Vitello, and the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. Because my father worked for IBM, he was first in line to get one of these new IBM PCs in 1981, which had just hit the market with the sonic boom of the adults entering the room. Microcomputers had been kits and then small plastic toys compared to the gunmetal gray IBM PC as it started being sold at Computerland for a completely unapologetic high price. With the IBM discount, my father was able to get a very basic machine with 2 floppy drives, a modicum of memory, but an internal 2400 baud modem, which, looking back, was like getting a mid-level car with a racing engine inside. There were no aftermarket parts on this. This was 100% IBM machinery. My divorced father set it up in the dining room, lined up against the wall with a very simple chair. All 3 of us kids had rights to use the machine, but only one of us made it their home. It was a machine that I could only see on weekends visiting my father. The IBM 5150 is an imposing machine, square with multiple colors of white and gray, completely metal sides, not a plastic panel among them, with a clear and straightforward IBM metal badge. You always knew what kind of machine you had in front of you. For me, it felt imposing, like a weapon or a protection or a defensive device. It felt like it was there to stay. For a kid who had seen nothing but impermanence throughout his life up to that point, this was a revelation. It felt secure, safe, and dependable. What I also felt was that there wasn't a moment to lose, not a day or breath of life when I had an opportunity to be in front of this machine, that I wouldn't sit there, messing around with BASIC, trying to learn different programs, even playing simple adventure games and arcade games that I could download. This machine was a revelation. My 2 strongest memories are using a word processor and my father yelling at me. The word processor was Personal Editor, which was crisp, clean, perfect for somebody who was downloading hundreds of text files, allowing me to clean up text files that I had downloaded, and otherwise writing my very own text files, preparing them to go out into the modem. The other memory of my father comes from the fact that there was a game I would play, a game many people are familiar with, especially when they first fall in love. The game can best be defined as, can I get things done before my father wakes up? My father would go to bed around 11 or 12. Over and over again, he would think that I would play with the computer a bit longer and then go to sleep. But there was so much beckoning me, so many wonderful worlds out there, so many things to do on the IBM PC, to swap between the floppies, play video games, or write text files, that when my father finally woke up at 6 or 7 in the morning, he would stumble out into the dining room, only to find his eldest son still typing away. He'd yell at me about the fact that I had ruined my sleep schedule, that I would inevitably fall asleep in another hour and sleep away the day, unaware that I thought of it as the victorious nap of a keyboard warrior. Time passed, years went by, and the IBM continued to be dependable. My father would add expansions to the IBM PC and his own life. After I told my father I wanted to live with him permanently, he sold his house, moved to another town with a really good school, and moved me into it, giving me the full second floor of the house to myself to arrange however I wanted. And what I wanted was a 2-part bedroom, one part with a bed and a television and different objects commensurate with a high schooler, and then a second room that functioned as the computer room, with an IBM PC that had now seen enough expansion to almost be unrecognizable from what it was a few years before. Now it had a VGA card, and it had an expansion unit that sat on top of the regular machine and allowed it to have a full 10 megabytes of disk space. In those 10 megabytes, I built a universe. I ran a bulletin board system. I typed endlessly on that machine, experimenting with all sorts of code and programming and writing. There wasn't any yelling anymore. Now I worked whenever I wanted to, with a machine that was just a few feet away from where I slept. It was a fantastic life. I enjoyed every minute of it. I recognized how lucky I was to have this machine in my bedroom and at my behest at any moment that I wanted. That IBM PC, which I had gotten when I was 12, was my daily driver well into my late teens. At 17, I was accepted into college, and I moved away to Boston. Now, a lot of people have different stories about how they knew it was time to leave home when they were officially out of the house. In my case, it was that when I was in college, my father ripped up all the carpets in my bedrooms, threw them out, repainted the walls, repainted the ceiling, and got rid of the IBM PC. And when I came back, I discovered everything was gone, and I was going to be sleeping on the couch. That's how I knew I was out of the house. And unfortunately, my father, by getting rid of everything associated with the IBM PC, got rid of all of my early programming and many other artifacts of my own computer history. I had stacks of floppies, to be sure, but whatever was on those hard drives is gone forever. A big irony for someone who seems to make a living doing that very same rescue for people who are in the same position. Throughout my college years, I strayed away from the PC. Macintosh, Amiga, SGI, Unix boxes, everything I could drag out of the trash or my friends' hands when they were getting rid of it, but none of them involving a PC compatible. I'd fallen in love with Unix and telnetting out to different internet hosts and how that all worked. That changed in 1995 when I started working for Psygnosis, where they needed me to show that I was proficient in DOS, and after a little bit of remembering and retraining, I was pretty good at DOS again. I worked in tech support out of Cambridge, and when Psygnosis moved away, I was hired for what came in its place, Focus Studios. I found myself working with another PC. The years had not been kind to the concept of the PC. Gone was gunmetal and large, imposing machines. What we had instead were cheaply made metal boxes that had a beige tint to them and very little to make them distinct. This machine, in my cubicle, even though it had DOS and all these magical elements, might as well have been a dishwasher or a refrigerator for how distinct it was. As Focus Studios started to fold, I was owed money for back pay, and I negotiated to just take this PC home with me. And that was how an IBM PC compatible ended up in my life again after I had walked out. This little beige appliance was slow and clunky and very underpowered. But there's one curious moment with it that I'll always remember for how it almost seems like another world entirely that I could do this. I was trying to upgrade some aspect of the machine. Time has lost that detail. I realized that the BIOS was out of date. I looked up the name of the company that made the BIOS, and I discovered, to my great shock, that it was located just 30 miles away in a little tiny town. And they actually invited me to come drive it over and leave it there. Made an arrangement, dropped off my machine, and 2 weeks later picked it up, upgraded, and able to run the memory or the hard drive that I wanted. Even within a few months of that, I felt that was pretty weird. That probably doesn't happen all that often. Maybe it was the novelty of me asking that encouraged somebody there to let me drop it off. But if you ever need to meet someone who hand-delivered his BIOS to the BIOS manufacturer for upgrades, hello. I used that machine until it could barely function. In the 2000s, I upgraded that machine for a much, much prettier one. It was, in every way, a commodity PC compatible, but it had all of those aspects of surface beauty that PC compatibles had in the 2000s. The machine by this point was half plastic, meant to glow with an oversized fan and lights inside. It was becoming, in many ways, its own show, its own status object before it was even turned on. During this time, I went to a LAN Party, another artifact long gone, where I packed up my entire machine and drove it over to the house of Sandro Hawk, where I played in a cowsuit Quake matches against a whole variety of players who I only knew because we were all bringing our machines to the same invited party. I had a great time that night, and I'll always remember it, and to my delight, the machine suffered no damage or weirdness for being loaded into a car and driven around in the dead of night. Fast forward again, 8 years. I'm living back in New York. I have my old machine, but I want to replace it, and an opportunity comes up. I'm being asked to do the DEFCON documentary, a wide-ranging and involved production that will take a year plus to finish and end up costing me all sorts of money due to tax problems. But at the beginning, when I didn't know that and the budget was being spent, I knew I would have to edit all of this footage, so I put money down to buy a machine. But not just a machine. I wanted to buy the absolute finest machine that I could find. I ended up buying a machine for about $5,000 out of the documentary budget money. I knew this machine could handle multiple streams of high-definition video and allow me to edit with no shortcuts. I knew that the video card was incredibly powerful, the top of the line at the time, doing all sorts of lossless rendering and then recompression using a variety of utilities to make sure that what came out the other side was the best at the time. I kept this machine, this oddly shaped, glowing, unusually powerful piece of equipment, no longer just an appliance, but an entire support network for the projects and work that I wanted to do. My buying that machine in 2012 paid off because I continued to use it to this day. That machine has ridden by my side through the journey of years of changes in my life, of incredible crushing debt and liberation from it, from editing words where I talk about what I do to broadcasting them to the world and sharing what I have to say. So I've begun looking for a replacement. Something powerful but simple, something which the world wants to think of as a generic appliance, but something that I can never quite think of as anything less than a companion that lives with me, online and off, for as long as I can. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, Thanks to James Bekoyanu, Mark Pilgrim, Peter Healy, Emilio Oliveira, Ernie Hershey, Michael Rubin, Matt Reynolds, Sean Kelly, and Anonymous, along with the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt.